Good evening, everyone. I am your host, Jason Myles, here for another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are a returning listener or subscriber, so glad to have you guys back with us. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you enjoy what you see, please make sure to hit that like button on the way out. And don't forget to hit subscribe. It is a passive gesture that goes a very long way. I thought I was doing the show alone, and lo and behold, this person came in to save the day like Han Solo in A New Hope. Please welcome the voice of reason on this show, M. Tucson.
Hello. Wearing some lovely wovens today, Jason.
What did you say?
You're wearing some lovely wovens today.
What does that mean? Well, I don't even know what that means.
Woven fabric clothing.
Are you shitting on my outfit?
No.
I'm trying to look like an adult.
Okay.
Why did you pause?
Just glad there's no kerchief today.
That's tomorrow.
Oh
Kerchief
no.
tomorrow. Wednesday's kerchief day.
Jesus.
It's starting to heat up here. So guess what that means?
Taco meat?
And
No kerchief?
better. Shorts.
Oh, I was gonna say no hat.
Shorts.
Oh
yeah. And I think I have to like walk in so you guys can see the shorts.
Dear God.
like as soon as the music ends, I should just stroll right into frame. So you just get the twig and berries in the shot.
Like every professional host.
I think that's what the internet is lacking right now. Right?
Your twig and berries.
My twig, and then I can give you a butt shot because I've been doing a lot of glute work.
Oh.
So it's a shelf back there.
Okay. It's where the bear sits.
Poor Paul is like, I had no idea this was the show I was coming on. Before I even get into this, I just want to say I enjoy the fact that we get to have Paul on as much as we do, and he is a sometimes why of the TIR family. And I have to say that because we want Paul to keep his job. Can't be too close to the fire. But I think this is going to be a show that some people are going to have some things to say about. So I'm excited for this one. For many, racism is an institution that is baked into the body politic. As our guest today mentions in his latest piece for Damage Magazine, the term institutional racism becomes shorthand for racial inequalities. The problem is, does simply pointing to these vast inequalities as simply racism do enough to truly diagnose the problem? Dissecting the seminal Black Power text, Black Power, written in 1967, Paul Prescod explains the shortcomings of the institutional racism framework. From the article, Going Beyond the Politics of Institutional Racism, Carmichael and Hamilton used the term white power structure to describe the complex web of domination that upholds and reproduces institutional racism. Again, to their credit, they attempt to explain how this power structure operates in concrete material terms. The white landlords who come only to collect exorbitant rents and fail to make necessary repairs, the white cop who will brutally manhandle a black drunkard in a doorway, and at the same time accept a payoff from one of the agents of the white controlled rackets, and the city department that oversees the streets in the ghetto lined with uncollected garbage, are all examples of this white power structure in action. While this analysis of racial inequality is much more grounded in material reality than a lot of the discussion in our time, There were fundamental problems with this framework even in their time. Labeling persistent social inequalities as expressions of an institutional racism is a misdiagnosis of what are structural features of capitalism, and doing so produces an incomplete picture of the other groups in society who may be experiencing similar problems. This may seem like a quibble over terminology, but it's of fundamental importance in determining the strategies and programs for combating racial inequality. While the language of institutional racism sounds like it articulates a systemic approach, it lends itself to a more limited policy agenda that focuses on effects rather than causes and prioritizes, ironically, individualistic efforts as solutions. Please welcome our guest, labor organizer and contributing editor to Jacobin Magazine. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there is a link in the description to Paul's latest in Damage Magazine. Please welcome Paul Prescod.
Welcome, Paul.
Good to be here as always. And yes, Jason, I know what I'm getting into every time by now. So
I mean, before we even started the show, you walked into this conversation Toussaint and I were having. It's like, whoa. Oh, the ukulele ate. Toussaint, I think you have the biggest question for Brother Prescod.
All right. I think what people all want to know is, Paul, why do you hate all of the sacred cows? Why do you hate Stokely Carmichael and the Black Power movement in this new article?
I remember last time, not the last time I came on, but it was like, why do you hate Marcus Garvey? And then it was like, why do you hate the March on Washington? Which I do. Yeah, I mean, I can start. One thing I'll say, I mean, just generally, you know, I in the piece I talk about Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton. They wrote Black Power in 1967, which was kind of the first articulation of like what Black Power could mean. It was also, I think, the first articulation of institutional racism. So just on a general note, even though, you know, people won't be surprised that I and people like Jason and others have a lot of disagreements with the people of that era advocating Black Power, I will say, compared to people today, like Ibram X. Kendi, you know, their work was far more sophisticated and grounded in a good material analysis. So, you know, and I think that when this concept of institutional racism came on the scene, I mean, I think it was motivated by a good impulse, and it was starting to get at something genuine, which was, how do we analyze racism and racial inequality that goes beyond individual racism, cultural beliefs, prejudice behavior. So that was a motivation of that. And, you know, it was this idea of like, you know, we passed the Civil Rights Act in 64, we passed the Voting Rights Act in 65, yet conditions of Black people are not only not getting better, but they're getting worse and worse and worse. So I think in that sense, the framework, I think, started from a healthy impulse. And, you know, when I kind of came across the term, you know, roughly 15 years ago, when I kind of started being a part of the left, you know, I was kind of searching for a way to, how can we think about racism as Marxism, not just be about don't be racist as an individual. And I was drawn to this term, but I think over time I kind of found there was a lack of clarity of what it really meant. And it's really become something that I think people just throw out there. It really makes you sound smart. I mean, it just does. Every time you say it, you feel good about yourself.
An angel gets its wings.
Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I think it's become something that's kind of gotten away from actually thinking about institutions. And, you know, now it's really common. I mean, even in pop culture, I mean, you listen to like a Black talk radio show or like a major, you know, station, anyone with a podcast, they'll throw this term out. So now I think it's pretty widely used, but it's become kind of a little bit meaningless. And I think now it's just kind of a way to say racial disparities, and it doesn't really illuminate much about what is causing these racial disparities. So that's why these sacred cows got to go, you know.
I mean, before we move on from that, I do think that's kind of an important point to talk about here, and I'm glad Toussaint wanted to open up with that, because when you write these articles, you're tackling things that I think people don't even really think about anymore, because they've almost become sacrosanct in certain aspects of the Black community, and definitely in certain aspects of African American academia. Talking about the nuances of now I can't even think of his name. Who was the first Black man we pissed off when Paul
Marcus
came
Garvey,
on? Marcus Garvey. There you go. That guy. The crypto salesman. The crypto
Mhm.
salesman. You know, we joke about it, but
I mean,
but it's beyond just, you know, the selling of these boats that, you know, weren't seaworthy. It is kind of, I believe he's a true believer to a certain extent. I don't think he's just a dirty snake oil salesman. What is your opinion of, let's call him Kwame Ture?
yeah, I mean, I think he was also a true believer. And one thing that's kind of interesting, I actually suggest people read his autobiography, Ready for Revolution. I believe it's written in the 90s. It's actually a lot better than I thought it was, thought it would be, and had a better kind of a class analysis generally than I thought it would. There's a lot of things I disagree with. And what I actually found is that the closer he was grounded to a movement that was tethered to a specific place and specific goals. So specifically his work with SNCC in the South, the Lowndes County Democratic Party or Freedom Democratic Party, I forget the exact name. His analysis during that period when he was working in that capacity, I think made a lot more sense. It was a lot more interesting. The more he kind of became, which he eventually kind of did in the late 60s, this kind of jet-setting international leftist star kind of went from place to place, giving lectures, giving, you know, he became known for inflammatory speeches and, you know, advocating rioting, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, he was concerned about the war in Vietnam, which of course isn't a bad thing. But once he kind of became that person of, I'm just going to kind of travel around to conferences and give radical speeches. You know, he went to various nations in Africa and was kind of, I wouldn't say working with, but maybe attached to anti-colonial movements. The more the analysis to me kind of just lost its grounding in reality. So, but again, I think it's a book is interesting and good to read, his autobiography. But yeah, I mean, I would say he was a true believer. And again, I think the book Black Power in 1967 has like tons of weaknesses, but I think in terms of describing the problem, you know, it hit the mark in many ways. And again, I know I say this probably every single time in the show, and people are tired of me hearing this, but it is interesting that he and people like Rustin and Randolph, they really actually came to a similar diagnosis, similar conclusion in the mid 60s that the civil rights legislation is not actually improving material realities for Black people, especially Black people in the North. If anything, things are getting worse. They actually both really agreed on that point. Then the question is what comes next. And I think the big weakness in Black Power as a book, again, the first half is not terrible. You know, they have good insights. They're describing racial inequality. They're talking about how this is working on a systemic framework and not individuals. But the problem really becomes when they turn to solutions. And it's really underwhelming. And I kind of go into it in a piece. I mean, they talk about, well, first we need to reclaim racial pride, cultural pride, community control of especially schools. That was a kind of big push in the mid and late 60s. And again, I mean, I think, you know, especially from our standpoint, it's easy to say, well, that's a bad idea. I think it made sense at the time, and there's nothing wrong with, okay, there's a predominantly Black school district, Black parents should have more control. But again, it misses the real institutional mechanism. I mean, take where I am in Philadelphia. I mean, our funding for our school district is predominantly at the state and federal level. And that's where, and the big issue is, I mean, in Pennsylvania, we don't even tax our natural gas companies in the state, and we're a huge fracking state. University of Pennsylvania, which has an endowment with $20-something billion, they don't pay property taxes at all. They don't do pilots or anything. So those would be the institutional mechanisms to fund the school district of Philadelphia more. That kind of tax policy at the state and federal level. So they talk about community control of institutions. They have a lot of vague thoughts about Black political power. And again, I think we can be charitable and sympathetic. Like in 1967, this is the very beginning of the wave of Black political power. So there's vague thoughts about that, and they kind of have a inadequate explanation of how that would be different than regular electoral politics. They say stuff like, well, they'll be controlled by the people. They'll be coming out of people power. Okay. So yeah, that's where the book becomes very underwhelming. And I think that's where the flaw of structural racism, institutional racism is because I think it's describing disparities and inequality that are real. Again, you just look at the numbers, you can't really deny a lot of these disparities, but it's misdiagnosing the cause. Because if you're looking at what is showing up as a racial disparity, it may not be caused by race necessarily. If it's caused by automation and it's caused by jobs fleeing to the suburbs and fleeing overseas, that's not necessarily a singular racial issue. But if you're diagnosing it as a racial issue, I think like the policy proposals are going to be underwhelming. And I think especially nowadays, they just turn into like kind of neoliberal solutions. And even though people want to say structural over and over again, they're actually not getting at the institutional dynamic.
Well, let's talk about that. Did you have something to say, Toussaint?
Nope.
Okay, I thought I'd cut you off. Let's talk about that institutional structural racism. To me, it's interchangeable.
Yeah.
It seems like you said, it's a term doing a lot of heavy lifting. When someone uses that term around me, I usually try to follow up with, well, how does it function? Explain the mechanism. Usually the answer is white power, white supremacy. When you get thrown that term, which I'm sure you hear a lot in the work you do, institutional racism, how do you deal with that? How do you explain that with that kind of original sin framework as well? Like racism is the original sin of this country and all that other stuff.
Yeah. And what makes it tough is that it's just hard. People using it are using it and meaning different things. And it's hard to know each person when they say it, what do they mean? But I do think asking questions like you do is a good starting point. Like what do they mean by it? I think just kind of trying to just pivot the conversation along those lines to something that is a structural, problem. So, again, when it comes up to education, I always bring this part up about like the tax policy in our state and, what that does to education. I think depending who you're talking to, it's also one of these things, I think it's very context specific. If you're organizing with someone in a campaign and they're a good person, but maybe they have some misleading ideas, I think sometimes you can just ignore stuff and pivot back to what you want to talk about. Because again, I do think a lot of people, they're using that term. They're trying to get onto something, the right path, saying like, there's something structural going on here. Maybe I don't know how to articulate it. Some people they're more cynical when they use it. But again, it's kind of hard term to deal with now because everyone uses it and it kind of means nothing now. I think just trying to pivot to something that really is a good example of an institutional mechanism that plays out in a way that disproportionately affects Black people, but is not necessarily caused by a racial policy. Is kind of the way to go. And it's kind of like the thing, I know Adolf has said this a lot, talking about during the Bernie campaign, if people ask him about, well, what about race? And the way he kind of explains it, in terms of regular people, it actually mostly makes sense. So like I think most regular Black people will kind of go, oh yeah, that does make sense. But when it comes to these, the political hacks or the media figures or academia figures who make their whole career off of this, that's when they can't allow it to make sense to them.
But what if my landlord calls me the N-word? Would that be institutional racism?
No. Be an unfortunate incident. That
happened to Toussaint the other day. She, the landlord was just walking up and down the hallway, and he was just, raising this nigger's rent. I'm gonna raise this nigger's rent.
I've never seen my landlord. My landlord is a corporation. So if my landlord calls me the N-word, is it not institutional racism?
I think that's institutional racism right there. If her corporate landlord
comes through a company email, which it probably will, then it is.
The nigger in 45B shall get a 20% rent increase.
But this actually brings up, another way of explaining this. Again, looking at these disparities that are real, and when I say they're not necessarily caused by a racial cause, it's like when we look at deindustrialization, where just as more Black workers are getting a foothold in manufacturing in cities, these jobs start to leave due to automation, due to offshoring, moving to the suburbs, all these sort of things. So looking at that, I have no doubt that the corporate elite in the 60s and 70s probably included a lot of individuals who were racist. I don't really have a doubt about that. But we really have to think, was it a matter of they got in a room and said, how do we fuck over Black people? Let's do this. Let's automate. No, they were acting out of they're doing what a capitalist does. And they were acting on these economic imperatives. And it shows up in many ways. And one of these ways is, it hurt Black people disproportionately. But it also hurt a whole lot of white people, as we saw and we're seeing today.
But they're not. I feel like they're at a table, though, Paul. There's a table, one of those big oval tables. There's a bunch of white people. It's dark in the room, and they're trying to figure out ways. They're like this.
Yeah.
What if we automate in the inner cities?
They're making German.
I could be wrong. Maybe they'll come like a hidden camera footage. Will come out and it's like, holy
like
shit,
a puffy video. It's just a puffy video of white people.
It's like, holy shit, that is how it happened. Damn.
White people in bathrobes planning things against Black people.
Right.
I see the niggas are smiling again.
They're holding their towels on while they're plotting against us.
This is something Touré Reed has brought up a lot. This whole thing around how agricultural workers left out of New Deal labor policy. So they, not included in the National Labor Relations Act. And many people take that as deliberate leaving out to exclude Black people. And it's like, well, it doesn't fully make sense when you account for the vast majority of agricultural workers at that time were white. So again, absolutely no doubt that the people who crafted that policy in the 30s probably had racist attitudes as individual and probably were not the biggest fans of Black people. But again, the fact that 80% of agricultural workers were whites kind of should make you think, was that really their primary motivation? Or was it, it kind of had to do with the agricultural industry at that time being able to lobby for clearly their economic interests of not wanting them to unionize, not having to pay into Social Security. So I think that's the way we should.
But did their heart break? Would their heart break when they knew they were hurting white people?
Apparently not enough.
White people will be hurt. Oh no. Never that. No Social Security, you say? Oh. I weep. Institutional racism framework is coming out of the more militant wing of the civil rights movement, and that will become the beginnings of Black Power. Would you say that much like its predecessor, Black Power, is a bit of a clientist politics?
And it's worth, people should remember that militant is not the same as radical per se. Militant is kind of like a style and posture. So, Black Power definitely had a much more militant aura. But I would argue, especially as time went on, looking at the substance, it really wasn't more radical than the Social Democrats. In fact, it was less radical. But yeah, I think it ended up being this kind of clientist politics. And again, when we talk about Black Power, when the term first emerged, it's pretty much meaning anything to anyone. It's meaning, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who actually did coin the phrase. It was not Stokely Carmichael. This is kind of debated. But I think Adam Clayton Powell was the first at a speech at Howard.
Light skin erasure is what I hear.
Yes.
Light skin erasure.
Paul won't stand for it.
Won't at all. At all.
We need to reclaim the legacy. But for him, it was like, hey, I've been doing Black Power. Adam Clayton Powell became the chair of a major congressional committee. So for many, it became, let's get more Black elected officials, and many were successful. For some, it meant let's grow Black business activity. For some, it meant like radical anti-colonial revolution. For some, it just meant cultural expression. So it's kind of meaning this phrase. It's kind of a catch-all phrase, meaning many things. But I think in all those different categories, for the new Black political machine, it was a clientist patronage machine that developed. Similar with Black businesses. There's a reason why you kind of have a surprising, not necessarily in the vote totals, but prominent Black figures who supported Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon actually did a lot for, opening up federal government support for Black small businesses and Black contractors. So that kind of clientist relationship developed there. And, for many, it was also, capturing a new emerging Black market. And at the same time, you have this growth of the Black middle class and purchasing power. So, I think in these different elements, this is kind of what it ended up being. And I think just because the analysis from the beginning prevented it from becoming a real, attack on the institutions of society and a more radical transformation. Because I just think there's no way it could have been done when it was limited to a kind of race-based conception, especially right at the time where, again, the Black middle class is starting to explode. And you're starting to get a way bigger class divide within Black America than you had in the 40s. So especially at that time, those kind of politics just were not going to be effective.
Also, does it feel like the more radical you are, or radical you're posturing in this era, you can get a certain amount of patronage, to your point about Stokely Carmichael? And you're not the only person to say that. I can't remember who did. I think Adolph Reed called it out. Someone else called it out, like back in the day. How he was making, all this money speaking at different universities.
Right.
That's how the Panthers were able to raise money, right? Talk real radical in front of these white people. There's a skit that Eddie Murphy did in Saturday Night Live in the early 80s where he plays a person named Tyro Green. It's a painter, and he comes out, he's just yelling at white people, and they just love it. They're just eating it up, and they can't wait to buy his paintings. So he's just yelling at them. Is there something to be said about a certain posturing to be able to get not just money for yourself, but also money for your foundation or your project?
And this is also when the, foundation world explodes and really starts funding these different elements of Black Power. Where foundations funding the Black Panthers, not necessarily, but as you said, and it's also just really ironic that these figures wind up speaking more so to white audiences than Black audiences, which is just like, it's a screaming irony right in your face. These foundations and, the Great Society programs, all these community action programs with foundation funding built around this idea of like Black political empowerment. And, you know, I mean, just fast forward today, I mean, especially since, you know, the George Floyd protests, I mean, I feels like, I don't have the numbers, but like white foundations are just like falling over themselves, defining seemingly militant or radical and Black. You know, there's just like a hunger for it. So yeah, I mean, it's very much like this clientist relationship, and also with the media. Now, it's true that the civil rights movement relied on the media, you know, and that was a deliberate strategy. Get these images out in the media, get sympathy, kind of create this kind of crisis. I mean, I think they were correct. That strategy was proven pretty correct to be fairly effective. And I think, though, with Black Power radicals, a different thing developed of like, let's shock. I mean, we're going to get attention by shocking people as much as possible by saying now we're going to one-up each other on how radical we can get and say things, and we're going to excite the students to you know, support us and give money. But I think that dynamic kind of directed as well is like they kind of, to remain relevant, they kind of also did need media attention. Because many of these organizations, I mean, I think that Panthers were an exception to a degree, also did not actually really have a mass base. So when you don't have a mass base, you also are, I think, disproportionately reliant on the media attention to remain relevant. And even the Panthers, I mean, it still was pretty thin in terms of a mass base. Unlike, and I'm not saying this to like hold up this organization as some great radical organization, but the NAACP, especially in its heyday, you know, mid 20th century, truly did have a mass constituency, you know, and a lot of people, a lot of chapters that could be mobilized, you know, they played a big part in getting people to the March on Washington. Again, regardless of their politics at different moments, what you think of them, there was a real base and constituency there to draw on. Unions have that constituency, but when you don't have that, it's more and more a game of getting into the media, shocking people. So I think that dynamic definitely developed as well.
You know, kind of staying with that foundation work point, BLM were trained Marxists, but they seem to lack a class analysis when they butted heads against the Sanders campaign in 2016 and again in 2020. Are we moving backwards when it comes to understanding Black American class dynamics?
Yeah, and I guess it's becoming too, I mean, even Marxist now, it's like becoming a term. I mean, if you can claim that, you feel radical and you sound smart. And I imagine, you know, if you're to the left and you're in a university and you're taking certain classes, you'll convince yourself that you're a Marxist. But it's like, what does that mean? You know, and as I say in the piece, I mean, where people were really revealed was, I think, in reaction to the Sanders campaign. You know, we all, I think, we remember how much hostility was met with from the types of people that would always talk about institutional racism, it's not doing enough, all this sort of thing. And it's like, here you have, as flawed as it was, you know, the Sanders platform actually represented, you know, dealing with institutional inequalities, you know, free higher education, universal health care, full employment, housing, all these sorts of things that would actually eliminate, even if they're framed universal, they would eliminate these kind of racial disparities that are showing up in different ways. And the way this was met was like, well, it was skepticism or hostility. So that was kind of the tell for me that like, okay, you're not really actually interested in addressing institutional inequalities. You know, and if you're going to say that, I'm no big fan of police, but if you're going to say like, well, we got a 20% police budget reduction in a city, how is that more institutional than something like universal health care? You know, I've never been able to make sense of that. But yeah, and it's a shame that we're getting more away from this understanding of Black class dynamics, because again, I think if anything, it's more relevant today because that gap, the class divide has become greater, you know, today than it was in the 1960s. So it's, it's even more relevant. And I think even more you can have different groups of Black people living very, very different lives today. So that analysis really is needed more than ever.
But, and I asked this to you in Tucson. I'd love to get both of your opinions on this. Does it feel then like we're just kind of stuck on a hamster wheel? Because then nothing has changed from the 60s and 70s. Just what a radical looks like now is no longer, a leather trench coat and a beret. It's dreadlocks and a doctorate, and being able to use words like structural racism. Are we doing the same thing then that was going on in the 60s and 70s, where there's people posturing radical for foundation's sake? Because BLM, they kind of win. Those women all walk away. Those foundations get tons of cash. Anyone that had, like you said, anyone that had a foundation, especially during 2020, or was Black, you got everything greenlit. We're seeing the end of the green lighting Black projects. I think they're just letting them out now. American Fiction. What was the other Black movie you people liked? There was another Black. Of Isabel Wilkerson. What's it called?
Cast.
Well, the book was called Cast.
Yeah, Cast. Her book became a movie. And there was another movie that was supposed to come out. I don't know if they shelved it, about magical Negroes, like literally about magical Negroes. David Allen Greer's in it. I'm not even trying to be funny. This is like the end. Like everything Black got greenlit at that moment. Will Smith made a horrible documentary about the 13th Amendment. Did you see that?
No, he should not be making documentaries.
I was the only one that saw it. It was just me.
It was just you.
Oh,
but no, seriously, is it just the same thing?
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
And what's worse though is, unlike this moment in the 60s, 70s, I think at least at that time there was still enough of a real movement around, or at least the recent memory of a real one. And again, even these figures who I would still criticize, I think at least had a little bit more grounded in reality than people today, and a little, I think, more sophisticated, even if I still disagree with them. So there was at least, I think, more of a movement around to be tethered to and to be grounded in. And now, this is not that same kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, now I will say the one thing giving me hope, and I really don't want to sound like I'm just like, can't move on from the Bernie campaign. I know it's over. I don't want to be that guy, but I do always keep coming back to this. And I probably say it on every podcast I'm on that Bernie comes up. It is worth remembering that when it was all said and done, Bernie Sanders won the vote among Black voters 35 and younger. And he was second to Black voters overall, which to me is a hopeful message of, like, again, when it comes to regular people, I think a lot of this does make sense and it resonates, and I can imagine even among people voting for Biden, I'm sure a huge chunk of them, it wasn't a matter of, I don't like Bernie or he doesn't have anything for Black people. It was more the game of who do I think can actually win and all that sort of thing. So that kind of gives me some hope that, even with all the attacks and all the noise about it, it did resonate with
but is that resonation Tucson? Everything Paul's saying, I agree with.
Yes.
In the year of our Lord 2020, it is 2024. Is that sentiment still there? Is that understanding still there? Or has race first won out, Tucson?
I don't know, because you do have the rise of ADOS and foundational Black Americans and all of this sort of thing. It came out in March, Magical Negroes?
I wasn't joking. It's a movie. But
I would have liked to have seen it.
I'm glad we didn't.
Okay.
Just look in the mirror when you see a Magical Negro next time.
We're all magical.
We're all trained Marxists.
But Paul, do you really still believe that is still? I think that's done as soon as those protests blow up.
Yeah, and it's again, it's also hard to track because like we're still at the end of the day we're talking about millions of people and how do we really track how it's feeling? But I think the shame of when you don't have someone like Bernie and that campaign going on is because what it kind of served as was like a form of political education and kind of a relentless redirecting to the major issues. So someone like him not doing that on a national stage kind of leaves this vacuum. So it's kind of hard to track what really is on most people's minds. But and I think many people, it's like it's contradictory. They're full of many things at once. But there's definitely now a vacuum where, racial inequality is not being talked about in a very public manner in that kind of way, grounded in class dynamics. It'll be interesting. It's just kind of astounding noting too, like, and in the moment where the Democratic Party is, going most towards race first policies and kente cloth, is the moment where they're actually starting to lose Black voters to Trump of all people.
Does the absence of that kind of Bernie hope create an apathetic vacuum?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think so. Yeah. But it'll be kind of interesting as the years go on. I think it depends what the left opposition could look like, but how is the Democratic Party going to be dealing with, how are they going to keep talking about race and all this? They're kind of schizophrenic with it, sometimes, again, kneeling with kente cloth and sometimes, being more appealing to like a suburban moderate on it. But it will be interesting how that plays out. But there's definitely, there's like a vacuum. Because again, the power of Bernie, even when you kind of were certain he wasn't going to win, was like, he's essentially doing political education on a mass scale, which is why him running as a Democrat was so important, because it just gave him the audience. Again, regardless of whether he will win or not, that was the power of that. So now that's not happening. It's just amazing that in this moment, right after a pandemic, Medicare for all is just like fallen out of conversation.
Totally. Okay. Question for both of you, lovely colored folks on the screen.
I am going to have the same answer as Paul right after he says it, as we have done the past few times.
I know we can say that we're all trained Marxists and leftists and anarcho-primitivists with a Islamic revolution fetish,
Asiatic
Black man. We can be all of that stuff, right? But seriously, it feels like it hasn't changed from just being basic consumer choice. And not really as ideological as I think we'd like it to be. Feels very consumerist to me, which is why I think it's just fallen out of favor so quickly too. I'm tired of drinking this soft drink. Oh, there's a new one here for me to drink. How do we even get beyond that? Or is that what's really baked into this country?
Simon's got to go first.
I have to go first. They have yet to replace the Squad flavor soda adequately yet. Sometimes the flavors don't get replaced fast enough. That is my contribution.
That's sad.
And I think the antidote to that is this is where the importance of being tied to actual movement work over a protracted period is important. And I know there's not always the same opportunities for that. There's labor as a whole section of that, but not only labor, but being tied to organizations that are doing this stuff over time. I think tacks against this idea of like the flavor of the month or just going from one thing to the next. And it's also interesting these with the kind of mini renaissance of the left in 2016. I was kind of struck by like all of a sudden these why are these Americans identifying as tankies? Like what is that? And it kind of just demonstrates like, okay, they kind of get into this in a purely online space. And sure, it's good. I mean, I think podcasts like this and everything is great, getting these ideas out there and people connecting with it. But when it remains purely in this cyberspace and it's not tied to reality or, engagement with reality or politics in the real world, that's where you kind of go off the handles. And I think a new rule should be, you can't call yourself a tankie unless you own a tank. Or
what if you have an old H2 Hummer? Is that enough?
No.
Those
or
things are big as shit.
More importantly, part of a state apparatus that controls. So I just don't know why you can't call yourself a tankie unless you are.
It's just all consumerism.
And it's really deep. I mean, probably more so than any country in the world. I mean, this consumerist strain is like really baked in this country.
It is. It's definitely part of the work that I do that a few people read. As you state in your article, much of what we see in the Black Power or institutional racism framework is designed not to tear down existing failed systems that are major factors in the racial inequalities, but keeping them intact, but with better Black representation. In this regard, would you call institutional racism a neoliberal framework of sorts?
I think so. And again, I think that's what it's become. I think when the term first arose, I don't think it necessarily was fully necessarily going to go that route. But yeah, I think today it is. And, there's kind of this weird rhetorical switch people will do. It's like, okay, institutional racism. And then the solution is this very like narrow policy. But again, now that today it's framed usually just as a way of saying disparities, it's like, well, if disparities is the problem or not necessarily inequality, all you got to do is fix the disparities. I probably said this a million times, but it's like, if the idea is like, well, these are, Black people are disproportionately represented in this low wage poverty work, whatever that might be, instead of thinking, well, it's not inevitable these jobs are bad jobs. It used to be working in an auto factory was a horrible job and it was turned into a better job. So instead of saying, let's make these better jobs for all workers, whoever they are, and we kind of know that if it's disproportionately Black workers, if we make the job better, they're going to be helped by that. It's going to be like, well, instead of it being a 30% Black worker representation, it should be more like 10% Black workers in this job and the correct amount of white workers are in this job. This is where the fights over Ivy Leagues are now. It's like, instead of, free public higher education. By the way, I mean, just want to add this in there, going back to Bernie, because I guess I can't let go. I should just admit that.
That's right.
If you remember, Bernie, when it came to Latino voters, he was through the roof. Absolutely number one, no contest, no matter what age group. And one thing that came through, one of the biggest reasons was the higher education policy and this feeling, among many Latino voters of how important education was and the idea of free higher education. But anyway, that's just to show like that kind of how it resonated with them, that this is such an important policy for the advancement of a certain ethnic group. But yeah, this fight over Ivies now is just like, well, instead of universal free higher education, which of course is going to disproportionately benefit Black people, let's figure out how to get Black admissions at Harvard up, at the University of Penn, which is going to affect 0.5% of Black people in this country. So again, it's ironically just not institutional. And it's kind of just like just another neoliberal way of looking at the problem.
Breonna Joy Gray went to Harvard, and it trickled down to me.
That's how he learned the word clientist.
Or trickled on me. One of the two.
That's, you should apply to Harvard.
As a
You
legacy.
should, you should actually do a social.
As a legacy because I got trickled on.
You should do an experiment like where you do like a chat GPT of like the wokest Afro pessimist like essay to get into Harvard and see if it works.
Oh man, I got to talk to you off air about that. Because somebody we know mutually is working in that world of helping people get into elite institutions with essays. Fascinating stuff I've been able to hear. Paul, there seems to be you are half of you is from the islands.
Mm-hmm.
Do they eat exotic salads where your papa is from?
No, at least not in Barbados. So carrot raisin salad, that sounds like institutional racism. That just sounds like, it sounds like something. That sounds like something white people made to make the world suffer. So.
You guys are mean today. This is the one show.
Have some like kind of black nationalist in me. So like this whole like raisins and whatever white people do, like I firmly see that as like a deficiency of the white race that needs to be addressed.
Paul was listening to the show about the carrot raisin salads, breaking pins. Like, God damn.
Breaking pins.
Paul's wife to be is trying to stop him from getting the pool cue out of the closet. Oh no, Paul, don't get the pool cue. That's how mad Paul got over carrot raisin salad. He was going to turn into James Evans from Good Times.
Well, what about this then?
I was watching the show live when this was birthed. I remember where I was. So yeah, I remember the origin story here.
But are you part of the origin story?
Wow.
Are you the son of a Pog and MLK?
Let's see, because wait, what I'm not quite old enough. Yeah, almost.
Oh God. What if they stored the sperm?
Mm.
Kidding.
Can you imagine people just tuning in thinking this is a serious ass conversation? They missed all the seriousness. They just hear us joking about frozen MLK sperm.
Ridiculous.
I have not seen the new Good Time. Is it worth seeing?
No, it's fucking Did you see the old one? Is there anything like? Hey, when people go, I haven't seen it. Is it? What do you mean? Is it worth it? No. No. You know why I watched Good Times when I was a child? Because I had to. That's why I watched it. It was black people on TV, and I watched it. I didn't understand shit about their life. Ugly ass nigga walking around talking about he's the fucking coolest nigga in the ghetto. What ghetto are you from?
Cabrini Green.
Man, that's why people from Chicago hate that show. Because I'm thinking string bean ass. Bernadette Stearns, I think that's her last name. Stearns. The young woman that played she's older now. Thelma. Who? Yeah, exactly. That's the best response for when you say Thelma.
Yeah, I think I'll skip. I've had enough bad black entertainment. I think last time I was on the show, I mentioned I watched the Shirley Chisholm movie,
That's
which is
right.
almost worth watching just for how bad it is and entertaining. It's like, Jesus Lord.
There's a theme song to Good Times, and if I start singing it, I feel comfortable that we would all sing. And there's one part that we don't know, and Bernadette says that part. She says she finally found out the lyrics after like 30 years. She didn't know what the lyrics were. You know, the part of the song.
Also skit dealing with this.
Dave Chappelle did a skit. They don't even know what it is. Because remember, people were saying stuff. He goes, I don't know what it is. That was like the joke. They didn't know what the words was either. Because one guy said, hanging in a jury. And Dave Chappelle was like, fine, I don't know what they're saying. For the longest time, and I know you thought this too, I thought it was hanging in the chow line.
Right. That's what makes sense.
That sounds equally as horrible, because what kind of ghetto Christmas Carol bullshit is this that this show opens with? The actual line is hanging and a jiving.
Oh,
that's much better, isn't it?
That is institutional racism.
You guys want to know what it is?
Some white writer wrote that.
Yes. Hanging and a jiving. Who talked like that? And from all those shows, who talked like that?
I'm seeing the chat.
Now that we have been demonetized, should I spare the rod on these hoes or keep my pimp hand strong? Asking for a friend.
This is too soon after Diddy.
Is there cameras in the hotel? Bill Cody says stepping and a fetching.
Right.
Stepping and a fetching.
That was the opening song. Ain't we lucky we got him? Good times. So Paul, you say don't keep it down. Pimp hands down, all hands down, all Glocks down.
Yeah.
Toussaint, what do you say? All Glocks down?
All Glocks down.
You know, Dizzle, if you ask me that question, I have to ask you more questions.
Good answer.
I need a situation that has come up, that has arose, that you feel corporal punishment is necessary. Have you come up light on your nightly earnings?
God.
You know, that's a real question when dealing with pimpatry.
Just to pivot, I saw in the chat. Yes, I did see the Rustin movie. It's horrible. Adolph Reed wrote a good review of it on Non-Site. Also, a good friend of mine, Dustin Guastella, wrote a good review on Jacobin. But the Shirley Chisholm movie is even worse.
Dustin is the guy with the mustache.
Yeah, I mean,
does he look like the V from
either him or Martin Luther King or Marcus Garvey? I think we talked about the movie when we had the producer Brother Outsider on. We touched on the movie. I didn't go nuclear on it, but it's pretty bad, man.
How bad? Before we go, how bad was Shirley Chisholm?
I mean, production wise, there's just like, shitty acting, shitty writing, weird production. It's all that as a movie. Now, here's the funny part. So, as I'm sure viewers know, Shirley Chisholm, first Black woman to like run semi-seriously for president, didn't succeed. I don't know what percentage she got. It was very low. So the whole movie, this is what is hilarious to me. it's like kind of like supposed to show her as this like trailblazing hero. The whole entire movie, her campaign staff is giving her very like common sense, level-headed advice, like, you know, you need to fundraise, like we don't have enough money, like you got to campaign in these states where you need votes, like you're not even getting endorsements of Black elected officials. This is a problem. Like, you know, common sense stuff. And everything they say, she's just like, I'm not playing this man's game. I'm not.
It's
like everyone just wants to doubt me, and I'm not doing it the man's way. And it's just like, well, we're doubting you because you got like 0.2%. It's like, I don't see where her campaign staff are being bad people here. But she's like, I don't know if this is how it really went down. I don't know why this is being turned into this like hero. She's just like not campaigning right. I know I sound like an asshole, but watch the movie and tell me I'm wrong.
Okay. You want to read this? You want to read this super chat?
Sure. I'm. This is from Prairie Fire Kowalski.
I think you meant Malcolm and Martin, but I support Martin Luther King.
Wow. Historical figure.
Martin Luther King is way different from Pog Chaser MLK. Is he a Martian or an illegal alien? Because there's so many different racist routes we can go with this impersonation. Toussaint, did you just log off?
No, I'm here. I didn't even get a chance to read it.
Well, I'm stuck at Martian Luther King.
I missed most of the show, but I think as a white Midwest farmer, I would have supported Malcolm, Martian, Mandela, and any other correct historical figure. I'm one of the good ones. Have you been drinking, Prairie Fire?
I just want to say that Martin Luther King from now until forever is my new favorite historical.
I actually really want to know if this was like a clever pun to say historical, like, or if that was
historical.
Because if that was on purpose, that's genius.
Nuri Yank and I have the same mind. I can't help but see Marvin the Martian as an MLK. That's what I see. The March on Washington.
Marvin the Martian.
Yo, that should be, you know, like the History Channel, they have like the aliens episodes. They should have one where it's like the aliens actually did the March on Washington.
Historical and Martian Luther King. Official TIR viewers and listeners, can we add this to the lore? Martian Luther King and historical.
Yeah, I want to get drunk enough to do that. That's like make those mistakes.
Well, Paul, I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know it's precious, and I appreciate you coming down here virtually and talking to us. I hope I get to see you when I go back east in a few weeks. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there are links in the description to Paul's piece. It is called, hold on, because its title's really long. I wrote it down. Shit, where did I write it? Toussaint, what's it called? Going Beyond the Politics of Institutional Racism by Paul Prescod in Damage Magazine. Again, wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there are links in the description to Paul's long titled article. Thank you, Paul, our favorite host story.
We made host story today. This is fifth wave feminism. It's not her story. It's host story.
It's host story. Yeah, not her story. There you go. You're gonna cancel me. Make sure you giggle on the way out. We will be. Someone asked if there's a champagne room. There should be a link up to the champagne room. If not, then I fucked up. I will put the link up, but I believe it's up. And yes, we're gonna have a very serious champagne room because there's some more black shit that I want to talk about in the champagne room. I want to talk about this return to respectability politics. I hate it. Not a fan. And we are going to break down one of the more popular videos on the chocolate side of the internet where they're just hanging and a jiving. Paul, have a good night. Tell
right.
Mrs. We said thank you for letting us borrow you. We appreciate it.
Right, man.
And we are out.